Yep. What's the New Deal? What's the president that brought that about? FDR. Okay. What was it all about?
This is a series of changes and updates to laws and policies that help financially and socially support.
Yeah. Cool. Great. It was not that far from the Golden Blocks. The Golden Blocks was one of those blocks, one of those streets, one of what I ultimately call physical sites of resiliency that the men drew on as well as other folks drew on in that community. In the 1940s, Augusta spent, according to Fox Butterfield, Augusta spent 20 times more on white students than black students. The dropout rate was prevalent. Right?
He said, what was the date again?
In the 1940s, according to Butterfield, Augusta spent 20 times more on white students than black students. Now, one of the reasons why he's raising this issue is because we're just coming out of the Great Depression. One of the things that lifted us out of the Great Depression was this thing called the New Deal. The New Deal was supposed to provide a lot of opportunity. Also, and more specifically, one of the areas was around education. However, when the New Deal went down, still whites benefited from the New Deal much more so than blacks benefited from the New Deal. So that's the point of me saying in the 1940s, right after the Great Depression, Augusta spent 20 times more on white students than black students. The dropout rates for black students in Augusta was prevalent. Yeah?
You know, it's like per student or is that full population?
Probably, they do break it down to individual students, so each individual student does have a dollar amount, even now when you look at the educational budget. But they also do it on more aggregate. There are aggregate estimates or group estimates as well. So it can be both. It can be both. How he's specifically arguing it, I probably gotta look at the passage one more time, but he's probably looking at it individually. That's typically how it's argued. Okay? Also, they make the dropout rate was prevalent, and there was very little money, according to Butterfield, for things like truant officers. Those are folk, those are authority figures, often who are hired in places like inner city communities who watch The Wire. They highlight this aspect as well. Truant officers who go out in the community and try and bring the kids back to school. Okay? The Floyd School was overcrowded. Anybody remember how many students were in that school? Yep. 1,600 students. 1,600 students. Do you remember how many teachers for 1,600 students? 30 teachers. Great, brother. Good, brother. Good. You know? But definitely, 1,600 students, 30 teachers. That proportion, that dynamic, for the most part, is in place in many inner city communities to this day. So I did a major project in Patterson, New Jersey. Anybody see Lean on Me? All right. That's the area of Patterson that I'm collecting my data out of the streets. We also went up to Eastside. We were not allowed in Eastside. We were allowed in the other big bad school. But we stood outside of the Eastside because, you know, after they get out of school, we have access to them. And little has changed since that movie, and the movie I believe came out in the late 80s or maybe early 90s or something like that. Little has changed with the school. In any event, if you look at a place like Eastside today, or if you look at JFK, the school, which is across the town that we were allowed in, the other big bad school, you're talking anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 students are in these large, low-income public high schools, right? Just imagine, you can only imagine, I mean, it's not that hard to imagine that there's very little that's possible in terms of the educational opportunity that's due them. But there's very little that's possible with that dynamic. All right, cool. Let me move on. Chapter 6. Let's stay on this issue of education. Butch. How does his problems at home affect him in school? And before I even ask that, but in addition to that, let me say, how is Butch framed as a student? Is he smart? Is he stupid? Is he average?
You're talking about Butterfield, right?
Yes, Butterfield.
Okay.
How are they framed?
If I remember correctly, are we at the period where he was in the orphanage or after? Sorry.
It's right around there. No, it's right around there. Right around there.
Well, I guess initially they assumed that he was not as intelligent because of his behavior, but in reality, once someone gave a little bit of effort, he was really intelligent.
That's the lesson we need to live from this now. So when we have little black boys in school who aren't doing well, like the Boskets, generation in and generation out. Essentially what Butterfield's arguing, essentially what she just mentioned, is that it's not necessarily indicative of the intellectual aptitude. So if a kid comes home with a bunch of F's, not necessarily indicative of his intellectual aptitude. Conversely, I would argue at least, if a kid brings home a bunch of A's, not necessarily indicative of the intellectual aptitude as well. I definitely argue that. Doesn't mean that they're stupid, but probably what it means more than anything is they know how to pay attention well. They know how to give the teacher exactly what he or she wants to get that A, which may or may not be indicative of what's really going on inside here. Can I get a volunteer real fast? Since I'm doing good on time, bro. It's only 11:06. I thought I was doing bad. Okay, Mr. Brown. Let's take it to 81. Yep. Page 81. Take it from, we're going to read that whole page right there, or most of it. The trouble began with Butch.
The trouble began when Butch was 6, and it was time to go to school. Francis enrolled him at the Silas X Floyd School, a segregated elementary school for African Americans. Only 8 blocks south on the corner of 9th and Florence Streets, it was a handsome, new red brick structure with white pillars and a wrought iron gate in the front entrance. The white-run school board would not have built it except that the Roosevelt administration had offered Augusta money through the National Recovery Act to build schools for blacks. Still, the school board kept its appropriations for running the Floyd School low. They didn't encourage blacks to go to school because they were afraid of us getting an education and getting organized, said Dr. Isaiah Washington, the principal of Augusta's other black elementary school at the time. In the 1940s, Augusta spent 20 times more per pupil. Per pupil? I'm sorry, I'm just looking at pupil for whites than it did for blacks. The Floyd School had 1,600 students and only 30 teachers for its 7 grades, an average of more than 50 students per teacher.
Oh. Let me just ask, the answer's right there. How many grades did the Floyd School have? 7th grade. Keep in mind, and I mentioned this before, this was not uncommon. Definitely up until the 3rd period, or up until the 4th period. It was not uncommon for poor blacks, particularly in the South, to be educated up until about the 7th or the 8th grade. They typically were one shack or rooms like this, and in these rooms, this one room would teach pre-K to 8th grade. At 8th grade, folk generally have to go to the fields and help out with the family. Right? And that's, so you're talking up until about the 1960s, more like the 1950s, definitely since the 4 decades of education began for most black people in the late 1800s during the period of black Reconstruction, from 1865 to about 1965, that 100-year period at best, I would say most throughout that 100-year period were educated up into an 8th grade education. 8th grade education. If you read a book called The Promised Land by Nicholas Lehman, he highlights that, he underscores that very point. Okay, can we continue, please, Mr. Brown? Yeah, Floyd School had, Louis Jackson.
Floyd School. Oh, yeah. Louis Jackson had 63 students in her 1st grade class, but there were only 40 desks and chairs, so the pupils had to sit together. By the time I got them organized and stopped them from crying and fighting, there wasn't much time for teaching, she said. The dropout rate was astounding for an elementary school. There were 400 pupils in first grade, but only 100 by 7th grade, as the parents needed their children to go to work and help support the family. The small budget for the education of African Americans also meant that there was enough money for only one truant officer for both black elementary schools combined. Every teacher had to be her own truant officer. If you had a child absent, you had to go to their home and talk to their parents yourself, Ms. Jackson explained. I don't know how they thought we would have time to do it. Between Francis working during the day and the teachers being overburdened, no one was fully aware at first that Butch was playing hooky. It started as a prank to see what he could get away with, and because he didn't like the classroom discipline. But it soon became a regular habit, as he fell further and further behind the other students in their lessons. It wasn't that Butch was dumb. In fact, he might have been the smartest pupil in his class. But he felt the compulsion to show off by breaking the rules.
Finish that paragraph off.
He had been neglected and rejected by his father and mother, and he burned with an inner rage. Skipping school was a way to demonstrate his anger.
Okay.